Good morning. Welcome to the AEI Conference on E-Cigarettes and Public Health. What's next after the FDA rule? I'm Alan Viard, a resident scholar here at AEI. I want to welcome those of you here in this room, those who are watching on the webcast, and those who are watching on C-SPAN. Last month, the Food and Drug Administration released a sweeping regulation extending its authority to e-cigarettes and other products that had not previously been regulated by the agency. The FDA describes the regulation as a measure to protect public health, but many observers argue that it will threaten public health by impeding the availability of e-cigarettes, a safer alternative to combustible cigarettes. All 5 of our panelists share these concerns about the regulation. Because time is short, I will not detail their eminent qualifications, but I urge you to look through the biographical materials where you can see them set forth in detail. Today we'll hear first from Saul Schiffman of the University of Pittsburgh, who will present an overview of the relevant issues. Then my AEI colleague, Sally Satel, will discuss the culture of tobacco control and how it influenced the regulation. Next, Julian Morris of the Reason Foundation will discuss the regulation's health implications. Stacy Ehrlich of Kleinfeld, Kaplan, and Becker will discuss potential legal challenges to the regulation. And finally, my AEI colleague, Alex Brill, will discuss potential congressional responses. Each panelist will speak for 15 to 20 minutes, followed by a brief discussion among the panel, and then we'll open it up for audience questions. Saul?
Thank you. Let's see if the slides are there. Yep. So I'm going to do a basic introduction to e-cigarettes, say a little bit about what they are, why we care, and what the data say about e-cigarettes. My background is as a health psychologist, working both in academia and in industry. Been doing tobacco and smoking research for a little over 40 years, and relevantly have been involved both with pharmaceutical nicotine products as well as now e-cigarettes and other harm reduction products, as well as academic activity. So I want to start with a basic fact, which is that smoking is bad for you. You may have heard of this. But often people don't realize just how bad it is, that in America alone, we kill off almost 500,000 people every year. It's 6 million a year worldwide. And in this century, it's going to be 500 million people. And that's a very important background, because it's against this background that we have to consider the potential public health benefits of e-cigarettes. Another more personal way to put these health risks is that a smoker who doesn't quit has a 50-50 chance of dying prematurely due to smoking. So this is a huge risk and a huge public health disaster, really. And if you think about the cause of it, you may remember the Clinton line that it's the economy, stupid. In this case, it's the smoke, stupid. That it's really the smoke, the products of combustion, that are responsible for almost all the adverse health effects of smoking. There are thousands of chemicals and many known carcinogens. And the point is that they're primarily products of combustion. And so it's smoking, not necessarily tobacco, and certainly not nicotine, that is the problem. And in fact, nicotine, by and large, has very modest harms. And back in the 70s, when I was starting out in this field, Michael Russell, a leading researcher in the UK, put it very compellingly, that people smoke for nicotine but die because of the tar and the smoke. And so in a sense, you can think of smoking kind of the way we came to think of injected drug use and HIV, which is that it's not the drug that's the problem, it's the dirty needle. And in this case, it's not the nicotine that's the problem, it's the dirty delivery vehicle of smoking. And so against this background, we can understand what e-cigarettes are and why they're important. And very briefly, as I suspect you all know, it's, although there are differences among the devices that we'll be talking about, the basics are pretty straightforward, which is that there's a heating element that heats nicotine and a carrier, usually something like propylene glycol, and that vapor or aerosol is inhaled by the user. And there are a variety of types. There's been quite a bit of evolution in e-cigarettes, and a progression from cigalikes, which look like a cigarette and are disposable, to rechargeable models with stronger batteries, to tank types with yet stronger batteries, and the effectiveness of nicotine delivery increases across this spectrum. You'll be hearing more about that. And that's important because this is a field that's still young and where there's still a lot of innovation going on with regard to the devices. So what does the science tell us about e-cigarettes? The Royal College of Physicians in the UK recently issued a report in which they make the point that the risk attributable to e-cigarettes is probably very small and way smaller than the risk of smoking. And an earlier report, which they relied on by Public Health England, had put a number to this, which was that they estimated that the risk of e-cigarettes was on the order of 5% that of smoking. So you have this huge risk I've described to you, and presumably a huge reduction in that risk if people could switch from smoking to these products. So what does the American public actually hear about the risk of e-cigarettes? Unfortunately, what they hear is mostly misinformation. E-cigarettes are no safer than smoking. E-cigarettes, I love this one, 1 million times more harmful than air in Hong Kong. And on and on and on. So the public is being misinformed about the risks of e-cigarettes, and not only by the press and by marginal scientists, but we're hearing messages like this come from the Centers for Disease Control, for example. There's another thread of alarm that people are getting, which is about things like, oh, they blow up in your face, they can cause fires. Now, there are actual cases. They're very rare. They reflect very poor manufacturing practices. And again, if you hold it up against the risk of fires due to smoking, this is absolutely tiny. And indeed, one of my favorites at the bottom there was a very recent paper that declared a significant risk for public health based on their report of 2 cases of individuals whose cornea was damaged by an exploding device. Not surprisingly, the public's belief that e-cigarettes are safer has been declining because instead of giving them accurate information, we're simply generating a lot of alarm. The point, more fundamentally, is that the issue is not absolute risk, but relative risk. No one would claim, I would not claim, that e-cigarettes are completely safe, but that's not the point. The point is being safer than smoking. They're not intended as devices for everyone to use. They're intended to be safer for you than smoking. And if you think about relative risk, nothing is absolutely safe, or very few things. Certainly, pharmaceutical medications, which are enormously helpful, are not completely safe. Methadone, we give drug addicts methadone not because it's completely safe, but because it's safer in the end than heroin. Bicycling is not safe even if you wear a helmet, which is a harm reduction device, or driving. So the issue isn't that this should be absolutely safe, but that it's way safer than smoking. So in that context, what's not to like? And there are concerns. The concerns, in essence, can be framed in terms of the population health benefit, which is a standard that's baked into the law that authorized FDA's authority over tobacco products, which is that rather than looking just at the risk to the individual user of a tobacco product or an e-cigarette, that the FDA is mandated to look at the effect on the overall population. And that means you need to look at people who may not currently be using e-cigarettes and may not currently be using any tobacco product at all. So Because the devices are presumably not completely safe, uptake by someone who isn't currently smoking or using tobacco presumably presents risk rather than benefit to that individual and ultimately the population. And there's been a lot of concern about the issue of gateways to smoking. That is the theory that if you take up e-cigarettes, that's going to lead you to take up smoking. And so even if e-cigarettes themselves were relatively harmless, if it leads a kid who wouldn't otherwise smoke into smoking, that would be a source of population harm. And I'll touch on that a little bit. There's a much vaguer concern about renormalizing smoking. Is it going to make smoking seem okay, even though it isn't smoking, right? People who are using e-cigarettes are plainly not smoking. It's very easily distinguishable. And so you'll notice that a lot of the alarm and frankly a lot of the emotion and passion around this has to do with protecting kids. And it's important to realize that. That's something that gets everyone's emotions up and perhaps makes it hard to consider rationally a sort of public health balance. But there is also, concerns have also been raised with regard to adult smokers, which is that if adopting e-cigarettes deterred people from quitting smoking rather than helping them quit smoking, that could be a source of public health harm. So I'll touch on most of these and give you a sense of what I think the data say about these. So first, with regard to adults and who is using e-cigarettes, I don't know if you can see that very well. That is the entire adult population. This is from a survey, the National Tobacco Behavior Monitor, that was conducted by Reynolds American, actually. And you can see the vast majority of adults, of course, don't use e-cigarettes. You can see that, but more important, you'll hear a lot of statistics about how many people are current users. And often what that means is that they say they've used it in the past 30 days. Well, most of those people have used it one day out of the last 30. In other words, someone with an e-cigarette say, here, try this. They had one puff, and poof, in these statistics, they're users. If you break it down by how many days out of the last 30 they have used, you see that red or orange slice is the ones who are using at least 27 days in the last month, sort of roughly daily users, is a very, very small slice. But at least as important, the use is overwhelmingly among people who were established smokers, and among those who are using daily, many of those were established smokers but have now quit, which suggests that e-cigarette use may be associated with quitting rather than persistent smoking. And if you look retrospectively at the history, the overwhelming majority of those were smoking first and then adopted e-cigarettes, not the other way around, which goes to this gateway notion. So let's look now at, we'll try to look at kids. This is from a survey, the PATH survey funded by FDA. Again, you can see that the prevalence of e-cigarette use in teens is actually very, very low, and it gets vanishingly low if you talk about at least 10 e-cigarettes rather than having just had a puff. So again, I guess I want to arm you as you see more statistics in the press to be a bit skeptical when they talk about prevalence, because often what they're measuring is you've ever had a puff or you had a puff in the last 30 days rather than what you would normally think of as use, which would imply some regularity. On top of that, if the concern is nicotine, it turns out that roughly 70% of those teens who are using e-cigarettes are using e-cigarettes without nicotine at all. So again, the statistics, as often cited, don't accurately reflect, are not interpreted in a way that's accurate. And if we then look at the order in which e-cigarettes or smoking were adopted, the green section of this pie chart are the ones who were smoking before they started e-cigarettes. And the red are the ones who may have started an e-cigarette first, which goes to this gateway notion. So let's look at this idea of a gateway. And the gateway hypothesis is a causal one, that taking up an e-cigarette actually causes you to start smoking. The problem is there are studies that show that a teen who's using an e-cigarette at time 1 is more likely to be smoking at time 2, but that doesn't mean one caused the other. It's the same kids who are interested in using e-cigarettes as in using cigarettes, the kids who are curious, rebellious, willing to experiment with anything and everything. And that's the kind of thing people try to control for statistically in these analyses, but it's really not possible to control for everything. And in fact, there's some evidence that e-cigarettes are a gateway out of smoking. There are now 2 analyses showing that in states that restricted sales to minors, the smoking rate among teens went up relative to expectations. So if you block that exit from smoking, you actually may cause more kids to start smoking. The other way to look at gateway is to look at what's happening in the population over time. So this is the data on the use of e-cigarettes over the last few years. You can see a very steep rise over time, particularly 2013 to 2014. So if the gateway effect was working, you would expect smoking among teens to be rising at that time too, because we're driving all these kids into smoking. And in fact, the data show the opposite, that along with this rise of e-cigarettes, we're seeing a decline in teen smoking, which is inconsistent with a gateway effect and probably consistent with a gateway out effect. Let's think about adults and deterrence from quitting. There's a meta-analysis that's gotten a lot of press that concluded that e-cigarettes impede quitting. But although this looked at 18 studies, the basic principle of garbage in, garbage out applies, which is if you put together 18 studies that are not valid assessments of the issue, you don't generate from that a valid assessment of the issue. And among the problems with those studies was that the people who weren't smoking at the time of assessment, often at time 1, weren't counted. So anyone who actually succeeded years ago in quitting with e-cigarettes is not counted. And then we try to assess the effect of e-cigarettes on quitting. But also that the studies often look at long ago e-cigarette use in relation to current smoking. And it's a little bit like, imagine a study that you did that showed that someone who took an aspirin when they were 15 still got a headache when they were 30. And you'd say, aspirin causes headaches because, look, it hasn't worked. There isn't time to go into detail, catch me afterward, but some of these studies are even worse than that in terms of the logic. So again, one needs to be very skeptical of some of these claims. What do we know in terms of data? So first, as I've shown you for teens, it's equally true of adults, that at the same time that e-cigarette use has been rising, smoking prevalence among adults has actually been declining. We've had a record decline in the past year. We have a paper that shows from federal data that the incidence of quit attempts is also rising. So it's inconsistent with the idea that we're deterring people from making quit attempts. Robert West in the UK, using population survey data, showed that among people who are trying to quit, those who said they used e-cigarettes to help them quit were actually more successful, not only than those who used nothing, but even than those who used nicotine replacement therapies like nicotine gum or patch. And finally, and I think this is one of the most interesting studies, Lois Biener has published a paper showing that if you focus not on just who used e-cigarettes, but who used them with some sort of intensity, as that's the word she used, that is at least daily for at least 2 months, those people were significantly more likely to quit. And furthermore, it turns out those tended to be people who were heavy smokers, who had many quit attempts, and who had previously failed on nicotine replacement. It's exactly the people you would want to switch to an e-cigarette or use an e-cigarette for quit. They've tried to quit. They've been unable to do it even with FDA-approved aids. Another issue that comes up has to do with the appeal of e-cigarettes. And I think it's worth thinking about the role of appeal in a harm reduction strategy. So the two dimensions here, on the x-axis is toxicity or harm, on the y-axis is appeal or satisfaction. And we're dealing with a product in upper right, cigarette smoking, which is both very appealing and very harmful. And one could imagine a product down here which is very non-toxic and very unappealing, and it would have absolutely no public health benefit. Because if it's not appealing and it doesn't compete with cigarettes for consumers' use, it has no benefit. And what we really want is a product up here that has low harm but a lot of appeal so that it can compete with cigarettes and get people to switch. And a lot of the discussion about appeal has focused on flavors, because flavors do presumably increase product appeal. We did a survey showing that teen non-smokers were really not very interested in e-cigarettes, no matter what flavor they were offered in, whereas adult smokers did care about flavors. Farsalinos has shown that e-cigarette users tend to switch to flavors when they're quitting. So it's not at all clear that flavors are a hazard. In fact, they may be a public health benefit. Let me end there by summary by saying clearly e-cigarettes are much safer than smoking. They address the current intolerable death toll that we have from smoking. And the absolutism that demands absolute safety and so on is, I think, likely to do more public health harm than good. There is a role for regulation. E-cigarettes probably shouldn't explode in your pocket. But as we're going to hear, the regulation has to be structured in a way that protects the potential for e-cigarettes to provide a public health benefit. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Saul. What a great overview. So you've just heard an outstanding data-based outline of what we know about electronic cigarettes and vaping to date. We know for sure that no one's claiming they're entirely safe, but again, it's relative safety, and that is undeniably true. It's also true there are things we don't know, and for example, you mentioned propylene glycol. We don't know what 20 years of inhaling that will do. I mean, most of the things that are limited in terms of our knowledge are simply a product of the fact that these devices have not been around and used really for more than about 7 years. As far as the gateway effect, we can say at least to date, we don't see that kind of a phenomenon. And smoking is for teens and adults at the lowest rate it's ever been in history. So these are all, would be encouraging, very encouraging bits of data. We've been collecting them for at least 5 years, and of course we'll continue. It's also clear that for a harm reduction product, and that's a key issue here, these devices are harm reduction products. Think of them that way, much more than as well, they can't even be considered a medical product. The FDA would not allow them to be considered that. They're tobacco products. But to think of them as something that we necessarily have to subject to clinical trials is it's not clear. Those are data that would be excellent to have, but since people choose whether they'd like to use e-cigarettes, they've often failed more conventional quit attempts, and in this way it's almost more of a consumer product. The kind of data we have so far, I think, would reasonably suggest that people should have greater access, as much access to these as possible with, as you mentioned, safety regulations. Everyone I know is interested in the safety regulations so that there aren't contaminants, that batteries don't heat up too much, these kinds of things. And that goes without question. But still, there remain so much alarm over speculative dangers and misleading spin and outright misrepresentation of the evidence by otherwise respected entities such as the CDC, you'd mentioned that, the American Lung Association, the Department of Health of the state of California, to take another example, and even the deeming regs themselves, which Julian will describe in much more detail, in detail, reflect an overcautious approach, in my view, for, again, a harm reduction product. So why is this? And that's what I want to talk about today. Why is the picture of e-cigarettes in the sort of the social and policy realm so misaligned with the evidence that we have so far? And in a sense, well, they could be called vaping wars. You've heard that, I'm sure. And if it sounds like culture wars, is really not a coincidence in the sense that, to a large extent, culture wars are not so much about facts, but about worldviews. And a component of worldview may be a tolerance for risk, tolerance for complexity, loyalty to affinity groups, and in this case, that affinity group would be the tobacco control movement. In short, there seems to be, in this policy arena, a lot more that's driven by cognitive style and ideology than by the evidence. And really, you could put vaping in the same list as other hot-button social topics, such as frankly, gun ownership, significance of global warming, GMOs, this kind of thing, affirmative action. I'm speaking now kind of teeing off of a great body of research done by people like Jonathan Haidt and Daniel Kahan at Yale University, and they have done much quantitative work on what Kahan calls cultural cognition, and as you know, Jonathan Haidt would call moral intuitions. So there is a big literature on this kind of analysis. It has not been done, for example, on electronic cigarettes, but a lot on global warming and climate science and other of these issues. But I think one can make a pretty good analogy to the e-cigarette situation. I also think that without an appreciation of the moral psychology of the vaping wars, it's very easy to get confused about why there is such controversy. So my first tip-off that this arena, where the controversy went well beyond the data, is the inconsistency in the public health community's attitude towards harm reduction. You'd mentioned before the classic is needle exchange and methadone. I happen to also work with heroin addicts part-time, and right now, in the midst of this heroin epidemic, we're even considering what I'd say more radical forms of harm reduction borrowed from Europe with actual heroin distribution. I mean, this is just being contemplated, but I know Ithaca and a few other cities were actually thinking about that. And these are classic responses to, again, classic harm reduction responses. And agencies like the CDC, granted, I don't know if they've approved of heroin distribution, but they're certainly in favor, rightly so, of needle exchange and methadone and condoms and all this. So this kind of harm reduction for heroin addicts is warmly embraced by the public health community. I'm not saying it's not controversial. There are politicians and citizens who are not in favor of some of these approaches. But within the public health community, it's really not debated. So why is that? Why is harm reduction an acceptable approach to heroin, but not an acceptable approach to nicotine? I should say the public health community is not monolithic in its suspicion about electronic cigarettes, but it is, there's far too much of it, to be sure. So, and you can even see the suspicion, for example, reflected in Secretary Burwell's comments when she introduced the deeming regulations on May 5th, which here's what she said: as cigarette smoking among those under 18 has fallen, and the use of other nicotine products, including e-cigarettes, is taking a drastic leap, all of this is creating a new generation of Americans who are at risk for addiction. It's almost a non sequitur. I don't know quite what that means. Now, I have one slide I wanted to show you. This was from a CDC. This is from a CDC ad, and it really was quite alarmist. I don't know how much you can see, but this is a woman who's about 34. Her name is Christy. She started smoking at age 13. And then somewhere within the last year or so decided to try e-cigarettes. I think she may have tried what's called a cig-alike. Those are the ones that look like cigarettes. And they work for some people, but they're often considered rather weak by committed smokers, and people often prefer those second and third generation devices that's all showed. But that's irrelevant. The point is she tried an e-cigarette, and it didn't work for her, but that's a fairly common scenario. She went back to smoking, and that's when her lung had collapsed. Now, collapsed lungs are not a very common side effect of long-term smoking, but they do happen. There are no reported incidents of lung collapses with e-cigarettes. She was exposed to e-cigarettes for several months. And the point is, this is an obvious attempt to confound e-cigarettes with an effect of smoking. It's really quite misleading. And in fact, the CDC, I was surprised I could find this online, but they actually advertised. This was part of a larger campaign called TIPS, where they have individuals talk about how they quit. And much of it's constructive. It's good advice for many people. This is the only one that had to do with e-cigarettes, but they had specifically advertised for someone who had ever tried e-cigarettes and had had one of the following complications, and one of them was a collapsed lung. So you're basically advertising for someone who had two events, but of course used in such a way as to imply causation when that is not the case at all. That's highly misleading. And it's consistent with many of the statements from CDC, which I've never been, which seem to be very suspicious again about the benefits of electronic cigarettes, tending to downplay them, but increasing the alarm about what could happen to children, which is not an unreasonable thing to worry about. It's just that the CDC data are showing this is not happening with children. American Lung Association, World Health Organization, I'm just going to go quickly through them, California, the next slide, please. Also, the California Department of Health has launched a campaign that touting the utterly debunked claims that vapors are exposed to formaldehyde. We know that high doses of formaldehyde are not in e-cigarettes as used properly. There are tiny trace amounts. There are much but greater amounts in cigarettes. And the amount of formaldehyde, to the extent that there is a trace, is not biologically significant. Same with Chicago. Mayor Rahm Emanuel launched an initiative equating e-cigarettes to, quote, liquid poison, and Alaska, e-cigarettes are not harmless, they are not healthy. So if people think smoking is as bad as, or vaping is as bad as smoking, the obvious consequences are, of course, that people who are contemplating switching and those who have already switched to e-cigarettes, this has happened a fair amount, will go back to smoking. That is a big problem, as is effect on public opinion. As you alluded to, a recent Reuters poll showed that Last year, 47%, this year, 47% of people denied that vaping was healthier again than conventional cigarettes. But last year, that was 38% denied that. That's going in the wrong direction. Why the controversy? Well, at the core, I think, lies sort of a tension between two camps, the precautionists and the pragmatists. The precautionists emphasize that the health risks of products haven't been fully established, and there's truth to that. But again, it's a matter of emphasizing that at the expense of what we do know, the relative safety. As you mentioned, Saul, they worry that cigarettes will renormalize smoking and undo the gains of 5 years of anti-smoking advocacy. Something reasonable to worry about at the beginning, but it has not happened. The gateway, as we said. The precautionists, which frankly, one could also substitute the words prohibitionists or paternalists, seem preoccupied with a yet-to-be demonstrated impact on children while downplaying and paying little attention to the established benefits to smokers. Precautionists tend to be preoccupied with, what I might call a contamination effect. And what I mean by that is the proximity to big tobacco, but in terms of nicotine. Well, nicotine is in e-cigarettes. Nicotine comes from tobacco. Tobacco companies are involved with tobacco. So there's a connection there, but that connection is taken to, is almost like guilt. Well, it is, in effect, to them, guilt often by association. Also, the fact that two major tobacco companies, Altria and Reynolds, do make e-cigarette products. So again, that's kind of this intolerable, in their view, this intolerable taint of association with tobacco. This is the enemy these folks, have been fighting valiantly and with some reason for such a long time. Along those lines, they wildly exaggerate the dangers of nicotine itself. And this stuff becomes very emotionally charged and a perceived threat to, as said, the hard-won progress against this, what used to be a stark villain, big tobacco. And the pull of these historical allegiances is very, very strong. And so accordingly, one would look to heavy regulation of and oversight by FDA. By contrast, the pragmatists, I'll finish up by describing who these folks are, do take the public health approach of harm reduction. They're not fixated on vaping as being completely safe, but whether it's safer, willing to make more policy trade-offs, more of a tolerance of ambiguity, I'd say. And they want to make e-cigarettes maximally attractive to smokers, of course. Ultimately, a lot of this comes down to a view of government. Is it, an enabling state that allows people and assists them in making their own choices with information and support, or a more paternalistic state that wants to use, the law and regulation to change behavior in a particular way? I mean, this is an age-old tension in society, to be sure, but it really plays out here. And I'll just close by saying, we can all agree, even though there's this tension between these two groups, and I have some thoughts on how they might be resolved, although I do think the deeming regulations are making that more difficult now. I think we can all agree that it's never a good policy when people are more invested in defending their speculations and intuitions than in testing them. And one first step here is knowing where the data end and the psychology begins. Thanks.
Good morning. Not sure where that's come from, but do we have... No, I think we've got a different...
Oh, there are two
I don't know
more.
if my
You can ignore them.
PowerPoint's on. No matter. I'm talking... Oh, I see. Okay, so I've got to... Here we go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the implications of the Food and Drug Administration's deeming regulations. I'm going to begin, though, with a discussion of where e-cigarettes, or as I'm going to call them, electronic vapor products, come from. I'm going to then talk about some of the consumer uptake issues regarding EVPs and how those feed back into the process of development of EVPs over time, or have done. And then I'm going to talk about which of the products that have been developed might still be on the market after the deeming regulations finally come into effect at the end of 2018, and what the consequences are for the future of the kinds of products that current smokers and current vapors will end up using. So I think it's helpful to understand where this all came from. In 2001, Onlik, a Chinese pharmacist based in Beijing, invented the concept of the electronic cigarette. At that time, he thought that it was going to be using a piezoelectric device to atomize a vapor of sort of a liquid containing propylene glycol and nicotine and some flavors. He realized in ensuing couple of years that a better device, more cost-effective and more effective in general, was to use a heating coil. And he then developed that into what became the first electronic cigarette that was marketed by his company, Golden Dragon Limited, under the brand Ruyan, which means smoke-like. This electronic cigarette, as has been described earlier by Saul, has a battery, an atomizer, and a cartridge. So the cartridge contains this mixture of liquid, the propylene glycol, some nicotine, water, and some flavorants. In this case, in the original cigarette, there was a tobacco-like flavorings. The atomizer is a heating coil that heats up that liquid, vaporizes it, doesn't burn it, and this is a crucial point, doesn't burn it, and then is drawn into the lung. When these came onto the market in Europe in 2005, 2006, people got excited about them and started using them. But people also found them not to be entirely satisfying. And in 2008, a couple of brothers, Taz and Umer Sheikh, developed an alternative to the atomizer and cartridge, combining it into a thing called the cartomizer. The cartomizer was a more effective device. It was able to deliver more nicotine more quickly to the user, and so people found that a better substitute for cigarettes. But the cartomizer, so some of the people using cartomizers then started, when the cartomizer itself had run out of liquid, they started injecting liquid into the polyfill in the cartomizer to basically recharge it. But they found that the battery on the device wasn't long; it didn't last long enough. So again, another group of people developed ways of attaching the cartomizer to a more powerful battery, and they used a flashlight battery for this. They modified it. These became known as mods, and so began the modding device. These were consumers. These were not developed by manufacturers, although the original developers of this device, which was known as the screwdriver, Matt and Ted Rogers, have subsequently made more formal versions of the screwdriver and are selling it. The next innovation came from another Chinese company, Joytech, which developed a combination larger, more powerful battery with a cartridge and an atomizer device. And this became quite popular. And this you could call a vape pen. And then the following year, a company developed a thing called the clearomizer. So this was a tank with a clear outside, so into which you pour a liquid, and and in that tank you insert. You can see on the right a heating coil and a wick, and the wick takes the liquid from that's in the tank and puts it into the heating coil, where when you press a button on the battery, it gets heated, and then the user inhales the vapor. These devices became incredibly popular. They're more powerful. They're refillable, and just buying the liquid nicotine is much less expensive than buying a disposable cartridge. They're easy to use and they're long lasting. There are all sorts of subsequent hardware innovations that came about as a result of the marketplace responding, the manufacturers and the modders responding to perceptions of what would be better for delivering satisfaction to the consumer. So larger tanks were developed. We saw some examples of that earlier. There's kind of more liquid for all-day vaping. The bottom coil atomizers. So one of the problems with the top coil clearomizers was that once the liquid has more or less gone, if you carry on trying to vape, if you keep on pressing the button, you can burn the remaining liquid or even release some metal from the coils. And vapors don't like that. It doesn't taste nice. So they didn't want that. So they now favour the bottom coil, where the liquid it remains at the bottom, right by the coil, and is much less likely to cause burning. Larger batteries that are long-lasting and more powerful were developed. You see these mods that are kind of the big square batteries, that amazing things. Variable current, low resistance devices. These enable more rapid vaporization, so giving the user the hit more quickly, thereby more closely replicating the smoking action, but also creating much more vapor. And you've seen now over the course of the past couple of years a trend towards things called cloud vaping, where people will draw in huge amounts of vapor and then explode it out in a torrent. And perhaps more important than much of the above is the development of microprocessor temperature control. So one of the health concerns that was raised was the possibility that at very, very high temperatures, you could generate excessive amounts of formaldehyde and other toxic substances from as a decomposing the propylene glycol or glycerin in the liquid. So with the use of microprocessor temperature control, it's possible to prevent that, eliminate that. All of these innovations came about as a result of responses to what was seen as desirable in the market. And we see that users prefer these newer generation e-cigarettes. So this is a survey of 2,800 current e-cigarette users who perceive them to be more satisfactory and more effective from refraining from smoking than older models. In the US, a recent survey, telephone survey, found that over half of those adult users using these electronic nicotine delivery systems, electronic vapor systems, e-cigarettes, whatever you want to call them, use tank models, 60%. Among adolescents, it's kind of interesting, nearly 80% use these tank models. And there's also other data suggesting that most of those adolescent users are using tank models without nicotine, or at least they think that it doesn't have nicotine in it. So suggesting that that's not their main reason for using the devices. This is a survey in the UK by Action on Smoking and Health, the UK's main anti-smoking group, which has, by the way, has been a very vociferous advocate of allowing e-cigarettes and not imposing excessive regulation. So an ASH survey, after they've done surveys on year for the past few years, and they show that over time, this is just comparing 2014 to 2015, there's been a significant increase in the use of these larger tank refillable, rechargeable systems in the UK. Here, slightly more than in the US, 66% of adults. Some work by Konstantinos Farsalinos, who is a cardiologist, but also an active vapor and proponent of vaping. He's done a lot of work looking at the pharmacokinetics of e-cigarette use, and has shown that the more recent devices deliver the nicotine to the user more quickly than the older device and in larger quantities. So here you can see a comparison between the speed by which nicotine gets into the bloodstream from a tobacco cigarette compared to and that's the green line. The blue line is older electronic vapor products and basically the little cigalikes, and the red line is more recent tank models with, in this case, 1.8% nicotine in them. Another aspect of the Action on Smoking and Health survey, which I think is interesting, is the degree to which consumers want to have different flavors available to them, and especially fruit flavors. So you can see the second largest category of flavors that are consumed by vapers in the UK after tobacco flavors are those fruit flavors, and then you have menthol, and then a whole range of other things. So the e-cigarette hasn't had an easy ride in terms of attention from academics analysing their health effects, as we've already heard, and some mention was made of the study done by Farsalinos that found over 70% of e-cigarettes that they tested. I think they tested 159 varieties. They found that about 74% of those contained both diacetyl and acetyl propionyl. And these things are known to cause in obliterative bronchiolitis, or what's called popcorn lung, because it was found in people who were working in popcorn factories. And it's fatal. This is a nasty thing. It's certainly something that people would want to avoid. These conclusions, when they came out, were shared widely among vapers in online forums. And in response, an online retailer, one of the main online retailers, VaporShark, had all of the e-liquids that it was selling tested and made available online. The findings, in other words, listing the amount of diacetyl and acetyl propionyl that were present in the various e-liquids that it was selling. Many manufacturers responded by removing the flavorings that contained diacetyl and acetyl propionyl. But it's worth noting that although there was this, I think, positive market response, the concentration of diacetyl in one cigarette is approximately 8 times the concentration of about a day's worth of e-liquid vaping. So one cigarette gives you about 8 times. So if you're smoking 20, I mean, you can imagine that clearly cigarette smokers are being exposed to much more of this. And so anybody who switches back to cigarettes in response to this study, and there were concerns that was happening, certainly Konstantinos Farsalinos was concerned, would be doing the wrong thing. So what are the lessons? Well, the main lesson is that choice and competition has driven innovation that has enabled vapers to obtain products, both devices and liquids, that meet their felt needs more effectively. And I've given you some of the examples of the developments that were that made this possible. Now, though, we see with the introduction of the deeming regulations this month, a grave threat to this. The deeming regulations essentially are going to limit the access of consumers to these products. They basically deem all electronic vapor products, electronic nicotine delivery systems, e-cigarettes, whatever you want to call them, they deem those to be tobacco products, which means that the only products that can remain on the market without applying for permission are those that were on the market already in February 2007. So what does that mean? possibly this old cig-alike that nobody uses anymore because it's not very effective. It is possible, in principle, for manufacturers to get permission to sell their product. And for the next 2 years, those manufacturers those products for which a permit is applied will still be able to market their products. There won't be enforcement actions taken against those products in the next 2 years. But come August 2018, will we have anything other than this on the market? Well, I don't know. We don't know. Well, there's a question, though. So what, are these products tobacco products under the deeming regulations? Because if these products, and on the left is a battery, which you can buy as a battery. On the middle is a flashlight, which was, of course, what was used by Matt and Ted Rogers to develop the screwdriver mod. And on the right is a homemade clearomizer. Homemade. So will these things be available? Well, I guess so, right? Will these be available? On the left, what's that? That's a mod device made using a 3D printer. And on the right is a 3D printer. So is the FDA going to ban 3D printing? Because if it's not, you're going to be able to get the device that's on the left. And if you can get the device that's on the left, then you have not done what the FDA wants to do, which is ban these things, right? There's a question here. Is this a tobacco product? Well, I think under the deeming regs, this is a tobacco product. It contains 1.2% nicotine, 12 milligrams per milliliter. But what about this? It's the exact same product with 0 milligrams of nicotine. Are you going to ban this? Okay, that's absurd. So what are vapors and smokers going to do? Well, some vapors are going to make do with the devices, the cigarettes. Some will do that. Some will develop their own devices and mix their own liquid from concentrated nicotine, propylene glycol, and flavors sold for food. Well, that's going to be safe. Some users are going to share designs and recipes online, including the blueprints for 3D printed devices. Okay, fair enough. But the problem is that these underground products and the markets that develop around them are not going to be subject to the same kinds of oversight that you get in the existing product market, where people are protected by consumer protection laws, where people are protected by laws of contract. If you're engaging in an illegal transaction, then you're not protected by those things. And sadly, some people will switch back to cigarettes. So given that the evidence is in, and e-cigarettes, electronic vapor products, electronic nicotine delivery systems, whatever you want to call them, have huge potential and probably actual public health benefits, I think there's a grave risk that the FDA deeming regulations, as they're currently going to be implemented, will harm public health rather than help it. Thank you.
Morning. Am I not pointing this the right direction? No?
Keep going.
There we go. All right, so hi, I'm Stacy Ehrlich. I'm an attorney here in DC with Kleinfeld, Kaplan, and Becker. We do FDA regulatory work. So I've been looking at FDA's deeming regulations quite extensively and been waiting for them for quite some time. And so I'm primarily going to talk today about the legal challenges that have been filed to the deeming regulations, but just a little more background on the deeming regulations. You've heard a bit about them, but FDA officially published the deeming regulations, the so-called deeming regulations, on May 10th of this year. And basically what that did was extend FDA's jurisdiction over from just the named tobacco products in the Act, which are cigarettes, smokeless, roll your own, to any product that meets the definition of tobacco product in the statute, which is quite a broad definition. It's any product that is made or derived from tobacco, including accessory parts, components, and accessories to those products. So it's a pretty broad definition in the statute. So on the day of, and what that does is, and the main part that is of concern to the panel and to people in the vaping industry and vapors is that it's going to require pre-market review of FDA pre-market review of all products that weren't on the market as of or on, as FDA defines it, February 15th, 2007. And FDA has given a compliance period so that products that are on the market before the effective date of the regulation, which is August 8th of this year, may continue to be marketed until, for a 2-year period, at which they, essentially for vapor products, we'll say a 2-year period. If they file a pre-market approval application by that 2-year date, they can stay on the market pending FDA's review, although FDA has said that they're going to limit that review period to 1 year. So we'll see what happens with that, since there are many, many applications, substantial equivalence reports on file with FDA still many, many years after filing. So we're not sure how they're going to get through all of these in a year. But the implications of that have led to a number of lawsuits challenging the regulations. The first one, Nicopure Labs, a vaping company, was filed on the date of official publication of the rule. The following week or so later, Lost Art Liquids filed a lawsuit in California. The first one was in DC. And then finally, Altria's cigar brand, John Middleton Company, filed a lawsuit on the 26th of May. So I'm just going to quickly go through the claims in each of the lawsuits, and then we'll delve into the substance a little bit. The claims in the Nicopure case include unlawful statutory interpretation because the FDA's broad definition of tobacco product is inconsistent with the Tobacco Control Act. They allege that the deeming rule was arbitrary and capricious in violation of the Administrative Procedure Act because it imposes an enormous burden without any rational connection to public health objectives, and you've heard a lot about that today. FDA did not do an appropriate cost-benefit analysis of the rule, which is required under the Regulatory Flexibility Act. And finally, they allege violations of the First Amendment free speech claims for the modified risk tobacco product, claims that now require prior approval or will require prior approval by FDA, and also on the free sample ban. So as with all these lawsuits, the plaintiff requested declaratory and injunctive relief, basically to stop FDA's enforcement of the regulations. Lost Art Liquids, very similar, violation of the Regulatory Flexibility Act because FDA failed to adequately consider significant alternatives which accomplish the statutory objectives while minimizing the economic impact on small entities. And likewise, an unlawful cost-benefit analysis conducted by FDA, violations of the First and the Fifth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment claim is based on required label statements, warning statements. And finally, that FDA abused its discretion because its rule lacks a rational basis for the extraordinary burden imposed. Finally, the John Middleton case I'll just touch on because it doesn't relate to vapor products, but it does challenge FDA's modified risk tobacco product provision because that provision will ban use of the term mild, which is in the name of the Altria cigar. So let's talk a little bit substantively about the claims. The first one is relating to the requirements under the Regulatory Flexibility Act, which requires that agencies assess the impact of proposed and final rules on small business, which is a large chunk of the vapor industry, and consider less burdensome alternatives which accomplish the statutory objectives but also minimize economic impact on small entities. In response to the proposed rule, the Small Business Administration filed comments that unequivocally stated that the proposed rules, Regulatory Flexibility Act analysis, lacked essential information required under the Act because it didn't discuss the quantitative or qualitative costs of the proposal on many affected small entities. FDA's final analysis is no better. And I just wanted to include some quotes from FDA's Regulatory Flexibility Act analysis to highlight the fact that they admit that their analysis is deficient. They acknowledge that they haven't quantified the benefits or the proposed or final rule. Then they list a long list of unquantified costs, including consumer costs for users of the newly deemed products due to loss of product variety or higher prices. These are real costs that they just haven't bothered to quantify. Compliance costs for components and parts other than complete ends delivery systems, and we'll get to how significant that cost may be, and et cetera. I don't have to read the entire quote to you, but you get the idea. And so FDA is required to consider alternatives that would reduce the impact on small business. These are the only four alternatives that FDA considered in their analysis. And you'll probably see that these aren't really helpful alternatives. They considered the exemption of premium cigars, which they rejected. They considered extending the compliance period for labeling changes to 36 months, which they didn't implement. They considered a 12-month compliance period for labeling changes, which is the period of time they chose. And this fourth one you may have read about in the news yesterday. FDA's initial draft that was sent to OMB of the final rule actually did not provide a compliance period for flavored tobacco products of any kind if they weren't grandfathered. So what that would have done, and this was actually written into the final rule, it's not an alternative they considered and rejected, they adopted this alternative. What it would have done was, as of the effective date of the regulation, August 8th of this year, all flavored tobacco products that weren't grandfathered would have had to been removed from the market until they obtained an FDA order permitting their marketing. And that was going to happen, but the White House intervened and made them change that. We assume, although those discussions are not publicly available. From the red line version that was released in the docket, it appears that all of those sections were crossed out while the rule was at OMB. So I guess bright side could have been worse, right? That would have been very, very bad, and so that didn't happen. So those are the only alternatives that were considered by FDA, despite the fact that in comments to the proposed rule, there were many viable alternatives suggested in the comments. Many of them were very logical. For example, FDA could have adopted product standards, and this is the way FDA approached the OTC review back when there were hundreds of thousands of OTC products on the market that hadn't been reviewed for efficacy yet. Instead of requiring each individual one of those products to go through individual product approvals, they created monographs, basically product standards for each category of products, and the products would have to meet those standards to stay on the market. If they didn't meet those standards, they weren't legally marketed, they would have to get an order or come off the market. FDA easily could have adopted product standards for vapor products. You can see the magnitude that FDA expects for the pre-market approval applications for e-liquids and devices, and the costs that FDA itself predicts, perhaps exceeding $2.6 million per application with thousands of applications. And FDA could have avoided that burden on industry and itself by implementing product standards, and could have addressed priority issues like exploding batteries. They could have addressed that much sooner than it appears it will be addressed by going through pre-market approval. Talking about the First Amendment claims, this is focused largely on the modified risk provision, which in the modified risk provision says that you can't communicate truthful and non-misleading information about the relative risk of your vapor product without going through a prior approval process. So that's part of the deeming rule. But under the First Amendment, with respect to commercial speech, as long as it's not misleading and concerns legal activity, regulations must be narrowly tailored to directly advance a substantial government interest. Now, the modified risk provision as applied to traditional tobacco products was upheld a few years ago by the Sixth Circuit. But in that case, the court cited the extensive history of deception by the industry to conclude that a stringent standard such as prior approval of modified risk claims was the least restrictive means to ensure protection of the public health. But that's a very different situation, right, than ENDS products, and FDA has acknowledged that. In its preamble to the final rule, it acknowledges that some evidence suggests that ENDS may potentially promote transition away from combusted tobacco use among some current users, and it's possible that there could be a public health benefit. FDA also acknowledged that use of ENDS is likely less hazardous for an individual user than continued smoking of traditional cigarettes. So the lawsuits have argued that truthful and non-misleading information to inform consumers should not be prohibited, until FDA has a chance to review and approve that information. And in fact, FDA itself, in its Regulatory Flexibility Act analysis, acknowledges that lacking complete information is a problem. So they've said market failure derived from inadequate information about product characteristics and quality leads to non-optimal levels of consumption and corresponding losses of social surplus. They also acknowledge that consumers' inability to make well-informed choices is a particular problem because tobacco products containing nicotine are addictive, and suboptimal initial choices can be difficult to reverse over time. So we've heard that that consumers not only have been uninformed, but they've been misinformed about the relative risk of tobacco products, and this, as FDA acknowledges, can be a real problem. The final claim that the plaintiffs have included in their lawsuits is that the deeming regulations are overly broad, that the Tobacco Control Act was primarily intended to regulate traditional products like cigarette smokeless, and ends did not exist, or vapor products didn't even exist at the time the statute was drafted, so how could the statute have contemplated these products? However, as I mentioned earlier, the tobacco product statutory definition is quite broad and really covers not only products made or derived from nicotine, but their components, parts, and accessories, although FDA has excluded accessories from the scope of the deeming rule, and we'll talk about that. So the lawsuits have claimed that FDA too broadly defined the universe of regulated products, and that undermines public health. Just to give you an idea of the scope of the deeming regulation, not only, as I mentioned, will the deeming regulation cover products made or derived from tobacco, but it will cover all components and parts. So all of these items will have to go through pre-market review. So you see the list. And we have talked about how the reach of this, and can it go to batteries? Can it go to software? FDA has said yes, and it will even cover e-liquids that don't contain nicotine if they are intended or reasonably expected to be used with or for the human consumption of a tobacco product, i.e., something containing nicotine derived from tobacco. So that expands FDA's jurisdiction quite a lot. Plus, FDA has said that it even intends to regulate entire lines of e-liquids. Even if some of them don't contain any nicotine, it will regulate all of the products in that product line as tobacco products. So I just want to end my presentation with a few quotes from FDA on the public health implications of the deeming rule as it will be applied. FDA has said itself, if, going forward, electronic cigarettes are proven safer than other tobacco products and are substitutes for other tobacco products, which we believe is the case, and if the effect of pre-market requirements on the supply and price of electronic products were large enough, which is expected, then the welfare effects of a reduction in supply of electronic cigarettes could potentially be negative. These are FDA's own words. Likewise, they said, if consumption of ENDS products entails individual health risks that are more moderate than those of other tobacco products, it is possible that, if provisions of the rule tend to discourage their use disproportionately, any ongoing improvements in population-level health risks associated with changing patterns of use of tobacco products could potentially be reduced. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us either here in the room or, as Alan noted, in the C-SPAN audience. Unlike the clinical experts and legal expert here on the stage, I've approached the topic of e-cigarettes largely from a public finance perspective and focused my research, some of which is joint with Alan and Sally, on questions related to the taxation of e-cigarettes. Since then, just by way of background, I've looked at some of the other related regulatory issues, including what I would consider to be an impressive proliferation of federal regulatory activity outside the scope of the activities that we're discussing here in the FDA, regulations from the Department of Transportation and from HUD, to name just a few. Also, just by way of background and to piggyback on some of the comments that were made earlier, I'd note that last fall I submitted comments to the FDA as they prepared to make proposals to regulate warnings and child-resistant packaging requirements for liquid nicotine. And I pointed out in that comment that they must consider the relative risks, a term that we've heard repeatedly this morning, just as others have noted. And just to dig in on that point, the point I made in those comments were that it is absolutely necessary and I think appropriate to pursue child safety type regulations, but we need to understand those in the broader context. In particular, we should remember that there are over 7,000 smoking-related fires in homes annually, and 14% of all fire-related deaths are the result of smoking-related fires. So there are serious risks associated with tobacco in addition to the risks that have been described earlier. And so while policymakers need to encourage e-cigarette-related safety measures, and child safety and liquid nicotine are among them, it must be done so in a manner so as not to discourage tobacco smokers from switching. And that's consistent with the comments that others have made as well. But I'm actually not here to talk about relative risks. I'm here to focus, as Alan noted, on a congressional perspective. Long before I ever heard of e-cigarettes, I think actually before they were widely available in the U.S. market, I spent a number of years working on Capitol Hill. I was the policy director and chief economist to the House Ways and Means Committee. And my role this morning is to reflect on the congressional aspects of public policy related to the deeming regulations and to e-cigarettes more broadly. We've heard from others about what's important and what the legal ramifications and opportunities may be. I'll try to answer the question, so what does Washington intend to do, or Congress in particular? And so let me just try to, in the next couple of minutes, touch on three issues in particular. The first, obviously, what do we know about the congressional's attitudes or perspectives with respect to the deeming regulations and e-cigarette regulation generally? Answer if this is a partisan issue, and if not, what are the divides in Congress that are relevant? And then finally, I'll take a minute at the end to sort of step back from this particular issue, look beyond the deeming regs, and comment on what role Congress may play in affecting e-cig use more broadly in the future. So with respect to the congressional perspectives on the deeming regs, I think it's important to distinguish among the activities within the final rule, in particular separate out the predicate date issue from the rest of the rule. As others have described, one critical component and the focus of others' remarks is this need to go back to take products off the market and go back for approval before they're allowed to re-enter the market and the consequences that will have. In addition, there are other aspects of the deeming regs as well related to safety and marketing. And I would note, and I think this is important from the congressional perspective, there is bipartisan support, and I believe little opposition as well, to a federal regulatory role with respect to e-cigs. This is important. This is significant in some respects. It's not obvious that that would be a consensus. In particular, from the right, we do not see an emerging position of advocating zero activity in this space from the federal regulators. And it's noteworthy because, in fact, there has been a lot of activity on the state level, right? The age ban that's being imposed is not a new issue. It's just a new federal issue. Most states, nearly all states, have put these policies in place already. And from the left, we're seeing general consensus around a strong regulatory framework, maybe an overly aggressive one, but not an outright prohibition, at least not explicitly. With respect to the deeming regulation and the predicate date issue, the ability of products to remain on the market now that the regs have been finalized, there is some strong support for a change from Congress. Most of that support has been embodied in what is known as the Cole Amendment. This is an amendment that was adopted recently in the House Appropriations Committee, full committee markup of the Ag Approps bill. I'll note optimistically that this was the most popular amendment considered that day in the House Appropriations Committee markup. It passed by a vote of 31 to 19. Technically, it had bipartisan support, and technically, there were multiple Democrats voting in favor of it, though, to be honest, that multiple number is just the number 2. But we should also remember the role of the minority in the House. The role of the minority, and this is not a partisan comment, it's just a process observation, is generally to oppose the efforts of the majority. It's not an absolute rule, but observers of the House will note that that is more common than not. And in particular, in the current political balance, it is the role of the House minority to support the president and the administration. And so if we wanted to be optimistic, we would say that really any support to the Cole Amendment could be seen as a positive sign and evidence of some bipartisanship. In addition, if you're an optimist, there's perhaps a bit of good news from the other chamber, the U.S. Senate. After the deeming regs went final, Senator Murray, who is the ranking member on the Senate Help Committee, along with 16 of her colleagues, wrote a letter praising the FDA for the final rule that came out. But the focus of the letter is noteworthy, and what's absent from that letter is noteworthy as well. The Murray letter was all about youth, youth marketing, and restrictions on youth access, the importance of those 2 issues, something that Sally noted and others have noted is reasonable and appropriate. A lot of concerns in that letter about flavoring, and a lot of rhetoric about the malintentions of manufacturers in this space. But what's not in that letter was the issue of the predicate date. Now, I would think, if you want to be optimistic, that silence might be an opening. I don't want to oversell this point. I think it'd be misleading to suggest that House Republicans, led by Congressman Cole, have led a strong effort on the predicate date and that Senate Democrats have paved a way to get that done. The Senate is not nearly as engaged in this issue as is the House. And it's because of the Senate's lack of interest on this issue that the predicate date did not change last year in the omnibus bill. So in short, I would say that there is some agreement about safety issues in Congress with respect to e-cigarettes and a willingness for there to be a regulatory role, and some moderate support for the predicate date to be changed. What will happen ultimately this year is yet to be seen. And so I think I've already started to answer the second question, which is this a partisan issue? And we should remember that more often than not, nearly everything in Washington is a partisan issue these days. And as I noted, the lack of enthusiasm from the House Democrats it should not come as a surprise. It doesn't mean that there isn't a willingness for Congress to engage on this issue. I'd also note that I think that Republicans who are pursuing a change here are looking for a deal. And you can see the evolution around the Cole Amendment as they've emphasized the safety concerns suggests to me that they are looking narrowly to make adjustments. Now, I say narrowly not to say that allowing these products to remain on the market is a small deal. It's a huge deal. It's what will allow these products and the innovation around these products to continue. But there is some common ground that's not being fought. Finally, let me just say, with respect to what's next after this issue. In my view, and this is maybe not surprising given that I've worked on the issue of tax policy and e-cigarettes in the past, I think that the next battle that Congress will look to tackle with respect to e-cig products is the tax question. To date, the fight over tax policy has been largely contained to the states. Kansas, Louisiana, North Carolina, and the District of Columbia have adopted and imposed e-cigarette taxes, as well as some local jurisdictions, Chicago and Cook County, as well as Montgomery County, Maryland, here locally. But the federal discussion about the taxation of e-cigs has been relatively quiet. But at the same time, I believe that the seeds have been planted, and Alan and Sally and I have written about this issue in the past. 2 bills currently that have been introduced in the Senate. This is S-450, the Tobacco Tax Equity Act, and S1129, the Tobacco Tax and Enforcement Reform Act, these are great titles, have both been introduced by Democrats, with Democratic co-sponsors, Senator Durbin and Senator Blumenthal being the leading advocates. These bills both impose high federal taxes on e-cigarettes. How high? Well, we don't know exactly. The bills would authorize the Secretary of the Treasury to establish comparable tax rates on e-cigarettes to those imposed currently on cigarette taxes, and one of the bills raises the cigarette tax as well. I think that this is a telling proposal. These are telling proposals because it goes to the heart of the issues that we've been discussing with respect to relative risk. The notion of imposing comparable taxes on e-cigarette products that would be imposed on cigarettes is illogical given the relative risk issues. And so to date, these bills have not received much attention, but now that the FDA has in fact completed the deeming process and deemed e-cigs, these bills may, politically speaking, begin to ripen. Thank you.
Okay, so before we move forward, I thought I would just take a couple minutes to fill in some background that we may not have fully spelled out yet concerning the pre-market review requirements, which really are the heart of the regulation, I think, and the source of the greatest concern. I think all of the speakers have alluded to how these provisions work, but I think it's useful to take a step back and maybe see just how dramatic they are and how burdensome. And I just give a brief view of how they came to be and why they're now being applied to products that they're really ill-suited for. So under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, there's really just 3 ways that a product introduced into the market after February 15th, 2007 can be marketed. One of them is to show that the product is substantially equivalent to a product that was on the market on February 15th, 2007. What does it mean to be substantially equivalent? Well, there's 2 possible ways that can be established. One is for it to have identical characteristics to a product that was in the market on February 15, 2007, where characteristics includes materials, ingredients, design, composition, heating source, and other features. So that'd be very difficult. And then the other way to show the substantial equivalence is to say that there are differences in characteristics, but there are no new questions of public health. So again, a very stringent definition that any of the characteristic differences that may arise have no new questions of public health. Not that it's as good on balance, but just that there's no new questions at all. And so since there appear to be almost no predicate products, as they're called, products that were out there on February 15, 2007 in the vaping segment of this industry, it's going to be very difficult for anyone to show substantial equivalence to something that was in the market on that date. The regulation, actually, the FDA says that in principle, someone who's trying to market an e-cigarette product could choose some other product category, like a combustible cigarette, and try to show substantial equivalence to that. Not obviously by saying that the characteristics are identical, because clearly they're not remotely identical, but supposedly by trying to show that the differences in characteristics raise no new questions of public health. But as the FDA itself says, that would be a very arduous showing. And so I don't think that's really a practical way to go forward. The second way to bring a product onto the market that wasn't being marketed on February 15, 2007 is to obtain an exemption from substantial equivalence. That's also very stringent, and I don't think there's really been very much attention to this possibility, and it's probably not very practical. But that's to say that the only difference is in an additive, and that the additive change does not, an additive in the product, and that change in the additive does not pose any health issues, and it's appropriate to exempt the new product from substantial equivalence. I think we probably set that option aside. So then the third option, which I think is what nearly all of the e-cigarette products would have to pursue, is to submit a full-fledged pre-market tobacco application. And that's the arduous process that some of the speakers have mentioned. And so extensive information needs to be provided to the FDA in order to submit a successful pre-market tobacco application, simply because the statutory standard for those applications is so stringent. So the manufacturer, by law, must provide information about the ingredients, the additives, the properties of the manufacturer, the processing, the labeling, and the health risks in order to demonstrate that it would be appropriate for the protection of the public health to introduce this new product where that consideration must take into account the risks and benefits to both users and non-users, and must consider the effects on the likelihood that existing users of tobacco products will stop using them and the likelihood that non-users will start. In practice, this will often require full-fledged clinical trials of the new product because you're attempting to show, to make an affirmative proof that the product will have a net public health benefit. So looking at that statutory framework, what makes it so extraordinary is that a new product that is going to comply with all of the substantive rules set forth by the FDA in terms of claims about modified risk, in terms of warnings, in terms of reporting of ingredients, in terms of not being sold to minors and so forth, that even a product that is going to comply with all of those substantive restrictions, which apply to both new and old products alike, still cannot be introduced into the market unless there's an affirmative showing that it's actually a net benefit to public health to bring it into distribution. That's not a requirement that we normally impose on most products in the United States. Now, the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, as amended by the Tobacco Control Act 2009, does impose precisely that requirement on cigarettes. And that's appropriate because we know that cigarettes are extraordinarily deadly products, and we don't think that there's any gain from having new cigarette varieties introduced into the market. So the problem, I think, with extending it to e-cigarettes is twofold. That first, the February 15, 2007 date, we know there's almost nothing out there that can serve as a product that's already in existence to which that could either be grandfathered or that you could use to show substantial equivalence. In contrast, of course, there are many cigarettes on the market in February 15, 2007. So using that date that would allow many of these deadly cigarettes to remain in circulation and then applying it to e-cigarettes where almost none of these safer products would be able to benefit from grandfathering is really quite an extraordinary extension. And then, of course, the other difference is simply that e-cigarettes are much safer, that putting the cigarette market into stasis, which I think was really the intent of the pre-market review requirement, is a sensible objective given what we know about the deadly nature of cigarettes, but really I think was not contemplated for a new product like e-cigarettes. The February 15, 2007 date, of course, was chosen because it's the date when consideration of the Tobacco Control Act started in Congress. And again, it's a date that I think seemed appropriate for the cigarette industry because there were many cigarette products already in circulation, and nobody really thought that we needed new ways for people to kill themselves with new brands of cigarettes. But then under the statute, it appears that date needs to apply to any other products that are deemed by the FDA, including the e-cigarettes. So actually, I wanted to pose a question to Stacy and anybody else who wanted to maybe could jump in. You mentioned that the FDA did not consider all these less burdensome regulatory alternatives that wouldn't have involved pre-market review. I mean, do you believe the FDA really had discretion to adopt any such alternatives once they had deemed e-cigarettes? I mean, their argument, I think, is that the statute really says once a product is deemed, it has to be subject to everything, including pre-market review. And so their perspective is, it's all or nothing. Now, I think many of us would say that if you're forced to that choice, nothing might be better than everything. But I think all of us would like to see some more moderate regime like you were describing. But would there be an option for that under the law?
I do think that they had the discretion to do that. And I think in the comments that were submitted to the docket, there were numerous arguments as to why they had discretion to take different approaches that would reduce the burden on these products. And in fact, FDA itself did it because the statute defines a tobacco product as including components, parts, and accessories. FDA explicitly excluded accessories from the scope of its tobacco product regulation. And that's a clear example of the fact that FDA believes that it has the authority to not apply all of the statutory provisions to all of the products that would be covered by the definition of tobacco products. So I think that they just chose not to put themselves out there. And, they probably have been challenged, just like they're being challenged now. But I think that they could have used their discretion to take numerous different approaches that would be less onerous to this market.
I want to make a slightly different point since I'm not a lawyer, don't even play one on TV. We need to consider two different things. One is how are products going to initially get on the market? And there's no question that there's a significant burden. There's going to be huge consolidation, and some of that may be good. It may not be such a great idea to have nicotine liquids that someone mixed in their bathtub in the back of the store. So there's going to be initially what products and what companies are able to get the resources to do a successful pre-market tobacco application. But I think another point we mustn't miss about innovation is that then improving a product is going to require a new pre-market tobacco application. And I've seen this movie in the pharmaceutical industry. It squelches innovation because there's a very high cost to making any small change. So the sort of incremental innovation that we've seen in this market, I think, is going to become very difficult. And frankly, a company from a purely commercial perspective, is going to repeatedly face a dilemma. Do I spend, $2.5 million with something that may make the product better, even safer? Or someone in that boardroom is going to say, let's just spend that on more advertising. And that's a real dilemma. So it's not just what gets into the market initially, but what happens afterward.
It's interesting, I think, that the FDA tries to claim that the pre-market review process is going to expedite innovation. It's really kind of hard to imagine how that type of burdensome requirement on any new product could really have that effect. It has been mentioned the FDA did grant some limited relief for products that are in the market on the effective date. They can stay out there for 2 years, and then if an application is submitted, which again is an expensive thing to submit, they could stay out for another year while the application is being reviewed. But I believe, and maybe Stacey, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that wouldn't even apply, that grace period wouldn't even apply to a product that was introduced after the effective date.
Correct. The product has to be on the market as of August 8th, and it cannot be modified in any way without getting prior approval after the August 8th date. Yeah.
Oh, I wanted to say something about some of the requirements of the pre-market approval. One of them, as everyone's mentioned, is the public health impact, as opposed to the individual health impact, which we know is net positive for smokers. The public health impact, mainly on children, that's typically the concern. That's an important question, but it could be done post-market. I don't think anyone is denying that this is worth pursuing. In fact, it will be pursued. There's no question the CDC will continue to follow it, as it should. The question is, does it need to be a condition of allowing these, to continue on the market? And I would argue no. But I just wanted to reinforce the fact that many of the questions the FDA asks are good ones. It's just that they shouldn't be they're ending up being a barrier to, as you said, innovation and the industry, as opposed to something that should be done but will be less of a barrier.
Well, thanks. So you've heard a lot from all of us, so now let's open this up for audience discussion. If you have a question, raise your hand and then wait for the microphone to come to you, and identify yourself and who you're with so we can include that in the broadcast. Yes, there.
Hi there, my name's Guy Bentley. I'm with the Daily Caller News Foundation. Following off Alex's points and intertwining with Sally's as well, talking about the making regular tobacco taxes and e-cigarette taxes comparable, how would you see the public health movement's response to that in that cigarettes and e-cigarettes will be put on an even playing field in terms of price, presumably then disincentivizing any price incentive to switch, in that lowering your cost of buying regular cigarettes and switching to vaping? How much public health support is there for that kind of move? Do you think people would generally say, while we still have a lot of doubts about e-cigarettes, they're still probably relatively less risky for you, therefore they shouldn't be taxed in the same way? How would you see the response to those debates coming up?
Well, I think the states have a big interest, actually, in wanting them to pretty much be that the e-cigarette taxes to be as high as possible or equivalent. I mean, this is the replacement revenue for potentially what would be lost if people stopped smoking. I mean, frankly, the only place I think it would really when you think about it, it's a sort of an extreme example, but you would love a situation where if you were a public health purist, no cigarettes would be available at all. So the only alternative would be vaping or quitting by other means. And that's not going to happen. Cigarettes are always going to be around. So from a clinical standpoint, which is, I suppose, a little different from a public health standpoint, but as a physician, I would like to be able to have a patient who would pay very little in terms of tax relative to cigarettes. I think, arguably nothing. So that would be an incentive to switch. They would be able to vape in public places. Not all of them. I could see some restrictions, but that would be broadened relative to what we allow in terms of smoking. And flavors, again, anything that makes e-cigarettes more attractive to smokers is, from a public health standpoint, the rational thing. Now, there are so many other forces that we've talked about in terms of the politics and the other stakeholders that I'm sure the tax will never be zero, but again, from the standpoint of behavioral change, you want these devices to look much more attractive than cigarettes.
Yeah, and I would just add to Sally's points, agree with them, and add that with respect to the tax policy, the focus has been, as Sally noted, on the state level around just the need for revenue or the desire for revenue, whether it be the declining revenue from tobacco taxes or just fiscal woes in the states in general. And then more broadly, the concept of equivalence, right? Both products have the word cigarette in the name. Many products are manufactured by similar companies. Both products have nicotine, despite the fact that this isn't really about nicotine. It's about everything else that's in the cigarette. And so that people are trying to draw equivalences between these products and then pursue that concept with respect to tax. There's been some discussion about having lower taxes on e-cigarettes, but even there, that doesn't make sense to me when we should be trying to encourage the switching, and then in fact that we think that there's evidence that the gateway is going towards the e-cigarette. If the evidence was different, then the tax policy answers could be different as well. If these were gateway products, then we might reconsider the tax policy, both the tax policy with respect to cigarettes as well as the tax policy with respect to e-cigarettes. But just as Sally's describing, I think there's an opportunity to use tax policy to affect the relative prices in a way to encourage the switching, not to discourage the switching.
I'll just reinforce that and point out that there was a study done a couple of years ago by the State Budget Solutions showing that states can save money by encouraging consumers to switch to e-cigarettes because of the reduction in expenditures on healthcare.
And often, of course, that's the kind of thing that's lost sight of because budgeting and tax policy, both at the state and federal level, often have a very short-run focus. And so the state sees, people are smoking less, that means less revenue for us. And in fact, of course, there's going to be a lot of payoff down the road when people are not being hospitalized and suffering from the diseases of smoking. But in the short run, the state sees a threat to its revenue source and says we need to do something about it. And so, I do actually hope that zero is the tax rate that applies to e-cigarettes, again, unless we get new information about their effects that would suggest that they merit tax. And they are still at zero tax in the large majority of states, but the pressure to introduce taxes on them certainly seems to be widespread. As Alex said, several states have already done that, and the proposals to do so have been made in dozens of other states.
Just one other additional comment. Outside of the United States, as other countries have considered this tax policy issue, in addition to what Alan described as the short-run versus long-run views that many policy officials face, there's also just a division where the public health officials who are looking at these issues are in a different office and different department and facing different objectives than those who are focused on the fiscal and budgetary issues. So we often have, clinical and health-related discussions, public health-related discussions in one audience, and then we have folks from the Ministry of Finance having very different discussions and making very different types of policy decisions.
Just had a point about the individual user's perspective. It's important to recognize while we've talked about health benefits, that smokers often cite the cost of smoking as one motive for them to quit, and users of e-cigarettes often cite the typically lower cost to them as a motive for switching. So at that level, this is an important lever.
Hey, Catherine Kauser from the European Liaison to Congress. So my question is, and this is to all of you, how does the current U.S. regulations compare to how other nations are approaching e-cigarettes?
Probably
Well-
better than Australia, but worse than Europe, which has just
England.
introduced regulations which are more sort of product standards. That's still onerous, but much less extreme than.
The rest of the world is all over the map, you might say. So in Australia, e-cigarettes are banned. In Canada, they're banned, but the ban is not enforced, so there are vape shops everywhere. The UK is, I think, a jurisdiction we should look to. As you saw in my quoting the Royal College and Public Health England, the UK, including its regulators, have taken a very different view. They do see e-cigarettes as a potentially beneficial harm reduction strategy, have been very open about approving the products as therapeutic products for smoking cessation with a relatively low bar and burden. For example, as you know, they have a National Health Service which has a very active smoking cessation service, and they now have guidance to support smokers in using e-cigarettes as a way of shifting away from combustibles. So I think the UK has exercised a lot of very strong leadership.
Good morning. Thanks for your presentation. My name is Li Yang. I would like to think about a public health policy. Currently, we have a carbon emission policy toward more taxation, but on the other hand, we want to legal marijuana. But I just thought, if on public policy there was a non-smoking policy, mostly from Democrat. But for the Republican, there will be some very arrogant officials. Even you have a wall sign saying no smoking, but they still, in front of a conference, they still smoke, the leaders of the conference. So I just wonder, more specifically, what do you anticipate the tax rate, and whether there's advertising, is no advertising, especially no purchase for the age that you mentioned. And then whether this will be non-smoking or exactly say legal marijuana policies, the kind of approach.
I'm not sure what the question is.
My
Go
question
to the
is
next.
sort of like this new invention you can approach. One is by the carbon emission type. That means you want to have more taxation, so to discourage the pollutions and the health consequences. On the other hand, you have legal marijuana that you don't want to say everything is taxable and everything will be very restricted. And so if you have a debate, Democrat or Republican, they have debate, this sounds rhetoric only because they don't need really to obey it.
Okay, thank you for your comment.
Hi, this is Shikha Dalmia, Reason Foundation. This may have actually come up before I arrived, but I just wanted to know, what is the data of who the e-cigarette users are? Are they new users or are they people who are switching from cigarettes? I mean, this question is obviously relevant because EPA is betting that there'll be more new users of e-cigarettes rather than those switching from tobacco, thereby creating a new public health threat. So what does the data show on that?
I did present some data that overwhelmingly current e-cigarette users are tobacco smokers, both some who are using both products, which may be a transitional state, and many who were smokers and have now transitioned completely to e-cigarettes. You see very, very little use among non-smokers, and if you ask about the order of product adoption, overwhelmingly people started with smoking and then transitioned to e-cigarettes.
Hi, I'm Robin Gougeley. I work with Penny Associates and consult with Reynolds American on their non-combustible products. I think there are a lot of misconceptions about what a change to the predicate date would mean, and I don't think that there's enough discussion about the other products that would come along if the date is changed. But can you talk a little bit about what authorities the FDA would have over the products if the deeming date is changed?
Take that. Pretty much everything else would be applicable to these newly deemed products were FDA to change the grandfather date. So any product that was legal, for example, if the grandfather date was May 10th of this year, the publication of the final rule, any product that was on the market by May 10th would not need to go through pre-market approval, but all of the other requirements in the act that are applied to deemed products would apply to those products. So establishment registration, product listing, ingredient listing, no modified risk claims, minimum age, potentially in the future good manufacturing practices, inspections of manufacturers, all of those things would apply to these products even if they didn't have to go through pre-market review.
I think just to add that you would still kill subsequent innovation, right? Because anything that came on subsequently would have to go through the pre-market.
That actually is a valid point. I think that it doesn't really make sense to have any kind of predicate date, that even if you change it to May 10th or August 8th, it is still a barrier to future innovation, but obviously much less than if it's February 15th, 2007, where almost nothing was on the market. Yeah.
Hey, Jay Keese, Capital Advocates. So in this country, we have a long, rich history of comparison between the UK sort of public health establishment and the US. Obviously, in the Affordable Care Act, there was a lot of conversation about what the UK was doing in terms of its regulatory regime and delivery reform systems. Is there conversation back and forth between the FDA and public health advocates in the United States and the UK? I mean, is there any pathway for these two obviously very divergent points of view with regard to regulation coming together and meeting in the middle somewhere?
I certainly hope so. I don't know if the FDA has discussions with them, but I think that, in fact, the UK really is a beacon for us. They have 19% of their smokers are now vape, and we're at 10%. We're going to, if things continue as planned, we're probably going to constrict our market, considerably. I think one way around that is, as Alan just said, not have a predicate date, but rather have an imposition of safety standards. And frankly, that's it, with, as I said, a lot of post-market surveillance. But no, the UK is wonderful. They have a very, very, frankly, I would like to put a lot of stock in the concept of a bottom-up movement, which is a lot of what happened in UK. It's a very active vapor scene, so to speak. And what makes it active and vibrant is the more people are attracted to it, because the more new devices are available. But again, if this has a chilling effect, it'll be hard to have a bottom-up kind of dynamic from here. Also, at the UK, the Royal College, for heaven's sakes, Public Health England, which is the CDC equivalent, their major public health intellectuals are in favor of, they see the virtues of e-cigarettes. They're balanced. They understand there are things we still have to learn more about. But again, that in the short, for smokers, the relative risk is undeniably much, much lower. And they are very vocal about that. The National Health Service has adopted vapor products. So we don't have that kind of leadership here, unfortunately. So we depend, I think, even more on a bottom-up kind of process, which the regulations could actually stifle, which is an added worry.
I think, just briefly, certainly within the scientific and tobacco control community, and I'm sure at FDA, people in the U.S. are very aware of the UK's position. I suppose, in a way, the UK may end up producing the evidence we need to convince policymakers here, because certainly the public health community, the regulators have been very supportive, and what we see in the UK is that smoking prevalence is falling. So they're going to be the experiment that shows that the things the precautionary folks are worried about aren't happening. I want to comment on what Sally brought up about a bottom-up movement, and I referenced the fact that I worked for a long time with the pharmaceutical industry on smoking cessation products. And it was widely held, still is in the smoking cessation community, that we had a problem that we had products that were safe and effective for smoking cessation, and nobody wanted to use them. You could barely give them away. And in fact, I was part of a Robert Wood Johnson funded initiative on consumer demand, which was an attempt to make the products and their positioning attractive enough that people would actually want to use them to quit smoking and save their lives. So contrast that now to where we have an active grassroots movement where people are lining up to pay their dollars to get a product that has nicotine and is safer, and now we're seeing that as a problem instead of a hoped-for solution.
I just want to clarify something from earlier about the predicate date and subsequent innovation. If Congress were to change the predicate date, yes, subsequent modifications would have to go through pre-market review, but they could potentially avail themselves of the substantial equivalence process rather than the PMTA process, which could be a huge advantage. Still not an easy process, but more manageable than the PMTA process, and I think that's an important point.
Just on this UK versus US, I mean, my understanding is that the community of public health advocates in the UK have been more favourably disposed towards the idea of harm reduction than especially in the context of tobacco, than the community in the US. And that partly probably comes down to Mike Russell being in the Institute of Psychiatry and having trained up a whole kind of a generation of harm reduction scholars. And that's then diffused into the organisations, Access Non-Spectrum Health, Cancer Research UK, which both of those groups have been very active in advocating for people to use lower harm products, including e-cigarettes. Whereas you see the similar groups in the US being much more sceptical. But there were harm reduction people in the US. So it's weird that how these sort of tribes emerge and align and are reinforced by federal dollars.
Hi, my name is Emily Anderson. I'm with Wilkinson Barker Nauer, and I'm specifically interested in the required, what would we call it, the advertising rules that are attached and the required health warnings and labels that are required. I wonder if you could just speak a little bit more on that and how that could potentially affect advertising in broadcasting or in other media.
There are no advertising restrictions in the deeming rule, but the warnings would be required in advertising and on labels and in labeling.
Okay.
No,
Yeah. So what's your question on the labeling issue?
Just with those labelings, would that have any effect on the broadcasting generally? Do you foresee it having an impact?
That ought not to have, I think, an impact, but a number of networks have their own guidelines that prohibit the advertising of vapor products or e-cigarette
And the warnings are
products.
quite different to the ones on existing tobacco products. So the main warning that's required is that it says that this product contains nicotine, which is an addictive chemical, right? So that's it's much different from saying this product may, cause all sorts of diseases and so on. So in a sense, that the fact that it's a differentiated warning might be better, might be better. But on the other hand, any warning that discourages people from switching, I think we should be concerned about.
The advertising, would there be any effects from the restrictions on modified risk claims?
Absolutely. And I didn't get to that, but you couldn't discuss in advertising that your product has is lower relative risk, or that even that it doesn't contain certain components. FDA has said they'll consider on a case-by-case basis whether you can talk about the fact that it doesn't contain, I think it doesn't contain tobacco. Is that one of them? There are a few that they would say they would address on a case-by-case basis, but really a lot of truthful and not misleading information about vapor products would be prohibited under the modified risk tobacco product claim ban.
Well, I don't think we've probably fully exhausted this important and wide-ranging topic. Unfortunately, we have come to the end of our allotted time. I'm hoping that many of the panelists will be able to stay around for a few minutes and answer additional questions individually if you didn't get a chance to ask something. But please join me now in thanking our panel.
Definitely have had you go first explaining the regs, because I was like,